In honor of Denver's decriminalization of magic mushrooms, doctors of Reddit, what, if any, is your best story of patients on hallucinogenics? Was working night shift on inpatient service. ED called to admit someone. We've got a 17-year-old down here with altered mental status. We think he needs to be admitted for eval monitoring. VSS. Chem fine. etc. etc. Now, I'm not a pediatrician. I don't do kids. I don't understand why the ED is calling me. But I'm an intern and it's 2 in the morning, so arguing about it is stupid. I headed to the ED. I get there to see a young dude sitting there with his parents. I'll mention that his dad was a full bird colonel and very much fit the archetype. And his mom seemed to fit that type of personality, too. The kid is literally rolling around in his bed, alternating between crying, asking if he was going to die, rubbing his dad's hand, and telling him how much he loved him. I had to sit there and take a history with a straight face from a 17-year-old who kept being distracted by just how much he loved his dad. I think my first question was, did you take anything tonight? And he was straight up and said, oh, yeah, like a red ton of acid. Want any? I 100% laughed at this statement. His dad was not amused. The patient was discharged the next morning. I had a patient who had taken an ungodly amount of Benadryl in a failed suicide attempt. A lot of people think that since it makes you drowsy, a bunch of it might be able to kill them in their sleep. Instead of killing them though, Benadryl basically gives you absolutely terrifying hallucinations for like 24 hours or more and then leaves you with the worst multi-day hangover you have ever had in your life. He would not stop yelling and screaming about that damn cat poking its head out of the ceiling tiles every single time I left the room. He also had short bursts of thinking he was covered in bugs and I would find him stripped naked and yelling into the wall. Had a woman come into the ED after ingesting some PCP. She was convinced she was dead and kept telling me she didn't get her last rites. At one point she stripped off all her clothes and shat the bed. Also mistook me for Jesus at one point. She was freaking out for nearly 24 hours. I'm a doctor. Not a great story. But I had a kid come into ED after taking some mushrooms at a bush doof and then feeling weird. We told him it was probably the drugs that he took. It hadn't occurred to him they might be linked. In my town though, the great majority of drug-related presentations are from meth. And they aren't pretty. We get meth-induced heart attacks, meth-induced seizures, meth-induced motor vehicle accidents, meth-induced sexual violence, and my personal favorite, meth-induced deheadery, where a patient is being a D-head in the community, and the police can't take them to the watch house so they come to hospital instead. I've been spat on, punched, kicked and called every name under the sun by meth-influenced patients. I've seen tiny psychotic women requiring 4 security guards and 4 police officers to restrain so that we can sedate them for their own safety. Meth is not good, kids. Edit, a bush doof is like a rave in the bush. Sorry for the confusion. I'm a paramedic, but this story is from back when I was an EMT, hand holder, oxygen giver, bandage distributor. Got called at night for a teenage male who had ingested mushrooms. On the way to the call, my paramedic partner was unusually silent. After a while she pipes up, I don't get it. He ate mushrooms. Like, what? Portobellos. She grew up very sheltered in the country, so that's how this was gonna go. We get there and the cops walk out, a skinny kid wearing only boxers. Took some shrooms. First time ever. Freaked out and told his parents, who called 911. My partner is spinning in circles and asking whether she should call poison control. I help the kid into the ambulance and onto the stretcher. Turn the lights down low and tell my partner just to drive to the hospital. The kid is calming down a bit, but he's tripping pretty hard, asking if his parents are Jesus and stuff like that. This was before smartphones, when iPods were the it. I had one of those radio transmitters you could plug into the iPod and then play music through the vehicle speakers. It had a remote that I carried on my belt along with a clicker for the ambulance. We were going to the hospital. Lights down low. Just being chill when I remembered what my partner and I had been listening to a couple hours before when we checked our equipment. Thievery Corporation. So I reached down and hit the remote without him noticing. A few seconds go by and he turns to me with the widest eyes I've ever seen. Whoa. What? Is this music? He was in true bliss. He kept asking me about the music for the rest of the ride. We dropped him off and I wrote "Listen to Thievery Corporation" on a sheet of paper and tucked it into the waistband of his boxers. I like to think there's some dude out there from upstate New York who fell in love with thievery in high school but doesn't really know why. Edit. Yeah, thanks guys for my first gold silver after being on here for years. It's also my birthday and you guys just made a ho-hum day great. This happened 13 years ago and I've had many great experiences in my career. But this is still one of my favorite stories. I'm happy you all enjoyed it. For those of you new to thievery, glad you found them. Also check out Cosmic Game, Radio Retaliation and Culture of Fear. They span so many genres but always bring a great vibe, and their message is pretty on point. One of the few bands I almost never skip. When I was a medical student, I saw a guy high as balls on PCP. I was working with a tiny little Asian chick who was a PGY3 resident. And when we walked in the room, this giant naked white dude high as hell sees her and screams that she was the devil or something. Guy lunges at her, and the cop in the room promptly slams him onto the bed. I try to help like any med student working in the field they wanna match in. And I swing around behind the guy, who's actively winning the MMA match with the cop, and grab him into a chokehold. Excellent bedside manner was a comment I got on my slip that day. I pin him for a femtosecond before he realizes he's crispy as it on that good old fencyclidine. And he springs his upper body forward, swinging me over the back of the bed seat right onto his lap. It took me like 5 seconds to realize what happened. I know right out of there right before the police tased him into oblivion. Hours later he was asking us rather politely for some orange juice with all 4 limbs restrained. First person to comment. This thread will turn into not a doctor but I guarantee it. Fun fact. In the UK magic mushrooms are classed as a class A drug for some reason, which is the same category as heroin and crack cocaine. As a nurse, patient came in running in the ER asking for a blood transfusion cause he believed that vampire bit his neck. Patient has no any visible marks or scars. Held him down for a while and asked him to calm down. He was so frightened that he asked for garlic to keep the vampires away. Eventually he calmed down and walked out on his own with no problem. Hope that you're reading this. I wanna take what you're taking. I am a medic. Was working a concert in Chicago at Northerly Island a few years back for Fish Fest. Get a call for a male with his face in the ground. Find a shirtless 20-something-year-old with his pants undone and digging his face into the sand. I get next to the guy and tap his shoulder. Say, "Sir, do you know what's going on? Are you okay?" To which he responds in the most classic stoner voice, "Do you know what's going on, man?" And digs his face back in the sand with the stoniest of smiles you can imagine. We coax him out of the sand pit and he tells us he took 10. Just 10. Couldn't remember what of. Just 10. And honestly 10 is bad number of anything. Lol. 10 tabs of acid. 10 grams of weed. 10 grams of mushrooms. 10 shots. 10 heroines please. So we let him sit in the drunk tank with the rest of the Trip Tower goons. God bless their trippy little hearts. Physician here. I have not seen anyone on mushrooms, at least not that I knew of, in the hospital. The drug testing for them is actually relatively difficult and not standardized, or at least it wasn't when I was training. I have seen people whacked out of their minds on PCP. We had a patient strapped down to a bed in 4-point restraints. This was actually pretty common with some of the violently psychotic patients in Philadelphia where I trained. I watched the guy somehow shake the bed to the point where he was able to stand up and waddled forward still attached to the bed in his restraints. As a medical student at the time, I'd just go out of there and let the professionals work that case. Patients on PCP will shatter glass, break bones, etc. and feel nothing until they come down. I have also seen a patient with Leishman syndrome. These patients will disturb you. Leishman is an enzyme disorder which culminates in extreme neurologic symptoms. These patients are classically known to self-mutilate, gouge their own eyes out, etc. The patient I briefly came into contact with would attempt to bite anyone the moment they walked by or got too close. It was super disturbing because it was completely without malice. This patient was also in 4-point restraints. Why would you ask doctors? The vast majority of people who take hallucinogens never see a doctor while intoxicated. I'm a doctor now. But before that I volunteered as a transporter. I had just taken a patient from the emergency department to the CT scan room. An announcement came on saying code strong pediatric emergency department security was needed in the PED-CT. This is usually a parent causing a problem. You just shake your head and hope security does its job. Suddenly I saw a teenage kid in a hospital gown sprint past the door of the CT room, flailing his arms and screaming. I looked out the door and at that moment this skinny 14-year-old teenager was tackled more like speared by one of our very large former linebacker security guard. Kid goes down wailing and they control him. I sort of slinked back into the room as if nothing happened. I later heard through the grapevine that the kid had done so much acid he was freaking out. Parents had taken him to the hospital to get help, but he had other plans and escaped, but not far. I've done plenty of LSD and mushrooms in my day, but they never gave me a full-on hallucination. Just made me laugh and I always had a great time when I did it. But meth, man. I was doing meth pretty heavily about 10 years ago. Been up for quite a while. Decided it was a good idea to drink some Steel Reserve and do some lines of this crystally meth that I had. And I DK what happened, but all of a sudden I was in a totally different room. I seen cat toys in the room and I told my friend at the time that there was a drug bust going on right there. It seriously looked like cops were wrestling a bunch of people down in her apartment and she's like, WTF are you talking about? Then I look at her and was like, wow, you look good for being 6 months pregnant. She wasn't pregnant, lol. I had Subway sitting on the table and I started holding it like it was baby. Then I went to go lay on the couch because I must have snapped out it, but not before I punched some dude in the stomach. Never ever will I do drugs like I used to. But I still cringe at that episode I had. Meth is a hell of a drug, don't do it. Especially the super crystally it. Nice try, lazy media outlet. I went into the hospital on mushrooms once and the weirdest part was probably me walking around my surveillance room wearing my bed sheets like a ghost costume. Actual doctor here. Busy overnight shift in ER. 16-year-old brought in with police custody. Like 3 dudes. In vests and heavily armed. Kid's eyes were huge and his body was covered in scratches. Apparently, he and his girlfriend did LSD for the first time. Took off all of his clothes and jumped a balcony. Ran through a forest, and she called the police. Police reportedly took the better part of an hour corralling this naked 16-year-old running through the forest, accumulating scratches from branches. The mental image killed me. The high had worn off for the kid at this point. Discharged on arrival. Essentially, my only medical advice was, next time, find a babysitter. But yeah, I live work in some of the worst heroin trafficking parts of the country. People can get real crazy. Not a mushroom story, but had taken a couple hits of acid early in the evening and went to watch a movie with some friends. They ended up driving and had to head another way. So I told them I'd just hop a bus home, was waiting for the bus. And while I was fully tripping yet, it was definitely making things burn a little brighter. The bus stop is at one end of the transit way and it was about 20-30 minute wait for the bus at the point in the night. Eventually I convinced myself I was trapped at the bus stop like Neo in the Matrix Revolutions was at the subway station. After an excruciating 30 minutes, which felt infinitely longer, the bus comes. And go home to ride out the rest of the trip watching something on my tablet. So I loaded up a whole playlist of Full Metal Alchemist since I was watching it for the first time. For anyone that has seen it, it was the episode where Alphonse faced off against Pride. I don't know how it happened, but at the beginning of one episode it recapped the past episode, so I thought I had already seen it. So I skipped to the next one. Saw the recap and had no clue what happened. So I go back to the previous episode. I did this for an hour. Eventually I gave up and put on Batman, the animated series, while the wallpaper melted. Always found the trick with hallucinogens was to just go with the flow since it was all in my head. Until I somehow ducked up a sequential playlist when all I had to do was keep watching. I also went to a deserted coffee shop at 4 AM and waited 20 minutes for service. Before leaving $10 by the cash and walking out with a tin of coffee grounds. Not a doctor, but my sister is a nurse. She told me one time about a patient who came in out of his face on God knows what. They got into a room where he was fine at first. They left him thinking he was asleep, but then they heard screaming, "I'm gonna jump. I'm gonna do it." So my sister and this other nurse ran to the room to find him stood on the end of his bed. He was in a room with 2 other patients who were now screaming at him about how much he had to live for and not to do it. Can't remember much else of the story except that he jumped and twisted his ankle while these other 2 junkies were screaming. My boyfriend is at Johns Hopkins right now, taking a heroic dose of psilocybin as part of their depression study. I will be picking him up in 7 hours. 2 weeks ago HW took a lesser dose with them. I can't say enough good things about the people running this study. I interviewed a kid on acid during medical school for about 45 minutes. At the end of it, I asked if he had any questions. He said, "Who's that guy?" referring to my bearded and bespectacled professor, who hadn't spoken the whole time. "What guy?" I replied. If you have to visit a hospital on hallucinogenics, your doctor isn't going to have any sort of story that paints hallucinogenics in a good light. Not a doctor. A good friend of mine overcame some anxiety by using mushrooms with proper set and setting. It was his first time and it really cured him of some issues. He says he doesn't feel a need to do them again.